Okay, I'm back and talking about PHP again. And this time I'm actually going to pay attention to what I've got written down because I did not do that before. I was going to talk about possibly exceptions. So, exceptions. It's such a complicated topic, but if you're not particularly familiar with programming, you might not really know what exceptions are, but um, you might be able to understand that things get returned when you call methods. In this case, it returns something that you can run a for each on. Great. So if something goes wrong, or if something has been wrong on the way into a method, um, you need to express that. Obviously, you need to stop doing whatever it is you're doing, and you need to express that something has gone wrong. Um, A possible way of doing that is to return different things depending on what's going on. So I could return string or null here, perhaps if I were thinking that an exception might occur somewhere down here. Or in principle, although not actually in practice because this is iterable, I could have return an iterable thing or null, or perhaps return something else that might more richly express that stuff. But um, to express the huge variety of things that can go wrong, there are exception classes. So they're classes. They're just like everything else. They just inherit from an exception object, um, and so you can have any variety of those. You can really express any kind of information that you want in those exception objects, and that helps the caller understand what's going on. But there are two kind of extra things on that. So, firstly, you don't really want to be returning two different types and have the caller have to stop and work out what's going on there. That kind of creates a mess. Um, and the second thing is that you also don't necessarily want the thing that immediately calls this method to get told about what the problem was. Because it might be that $requests was just passed into the method above this one. You don't know that. So, well, I'm giving $requests as an example because this is something that will actually produce a runtime exception if it's of the wrong type. So the method above might have just accepted $requests passed in. It might not have special knowledge about what this stuff means. So it's useful for control to go all the way up to something that actually understands what's going on with this error message and can handle it. And that's where exceptions are meaningful, because exceptions will actually stop whatever's going on. So when you have throw statement and an exception object, control immediately stops there, and it will go up each layer of the stack. I'm kind of I'm not giving you an example of this with my mouse pointer. It's just it'll go up through each method in essence. So it'll go up through the stack until it finds a part of the code that is prepared to deal with the exception, which is to say one that has a try block around some code, and it has a catch block that will accept the exception. So yeah, you can use that to get the description of the problem to a place where that description can be handled, maybe, or at the very least to a level where that information can be logged and dealt with later. So there are some problems that you have with this. So in particular, it's easy to have. You can have too many exceptions. You can have a situation where an exception would frequently be emitted, and the level immediately above would always be the one that catches it. And where you have that, you probably do want to just return like a false value. That would be easier to deal with, and the caller will be able to understand that. So it's not, if you have multiple different problems to express, that gets a little bit more complicated because even so, if you're in a situation where you are performing an action and you just want to indicate whether the action succeeded or not, the convention with POSIX, with Unix, is that you would return 0 for success and a number that's not 0 for everything else, which confusingly means that you would return true on failure and false on success. People struggle with this, obviously. So it is complicated where you have multiple different things that can go wrong. So usually with those, you would do exceptions, even if they are being caught immediately above, you would do that. Yes, and the other thing that's that's questionable in terms of exceptions is whether you continue. So you can just keep going in some cases. You can just say, you know what, I know you didn't provide any requests. I'm just going to not do anything. Or you might say, I know you did provide some requests. Some of them were of the wrong type. I'm just going to ignore them. That's a legitimate thing to do. Usually, if you're doing that, you should log that there was a problem. That's something that trigger_error will do. Usually, that's what you want to use. But it depends. So there are situations where it's more beneficial to continue and where you can clearly understand that continuing will still work. But when you're not sure, it's often better to stop at the earliest possible opportunity and pass control up to the highest possible level so that nothing further happens, because who knows what your program is being used for. It might be something that's critically important and you don't want it to produce a mess past the point where you know that a mess is being produced. So yes, it's kind of a complicated thing. Right, so I'm actually going to get on to, just after regretting all of these changes I had to make here, I'm going to get onto the actual class, the real class. There you go. So this one I did put some class documentation on. So again, in contexts where people can see documentation for classes, this would pop up or it would be visible. So this is helpful for somebody to understand what it is that the thing does. And that's the thing that I want people to have to understand. So this, you might realize, is this is very similar to the other one. Well, this isn't the same method, in fact. And that same method is, here it is. This is the same method, and this also has the wrong documentation, which I need to fix. But I'll get down to that in a minute. And actually, you can see I obviously copied and pasted here, but I'll deal with that in a minute. So yes, this one actually has multiple arguments. Thank you, multiple arguments. That's something I wanted to see. You can see the syntax highlighting is a little bit off with this. I'm going to blame Visual Studio Code for that because it doesn't need to be. It could be working. It's just not working for some reason. So this is a static function. That's one that can be called without an object. That's what it means by static, that it's not one that is different depending on what you have, because you don't have anything. You just have the arguments that you're providing. So the way you call these is you put the class name, which can be a subclass for this purpose. So class name, : and then the name of the static method or static function, if you prefer to call it that, and then just the arguments as usual. So you can see this takes 3 arguments. This is a slightly more complicated case, so you can see that we've got an assignment in here. So that's something that you would certainly have seen in other languages. That's a default value. So these are primitive values only. In fact, I know that So these are primitive simple values, in fact. So you can't call something in here. That's basically the key thing, and you can't do operators. You can't do things like concatenation in there. That won't be allowed. But if you have like a single value, even if it's an array with some stuff in it, I believe, so I think you can have that. Yeah, that would work. So in essence, so these two values will be stored at compile time, and then when a caller uses it, they will be substituted for the missing arguments. So this basically means that you can call this with one argument if you so desire, or two arguments, and it will still continue and it will still work. A little bit annoyingly, I'm not documenting what the default timeout is. This is something that probably would be useful. It varies a bit with this stuff. So sometimes this provides useful information that you would want to communicate to people. Sometimes it's just completely heuristic, and you don't really want to be sticking it in the documentation, because then you would have to explain every time you change it, and you might change it just for completely innocuous reasons. Look at this. Just look at this. Oh, wow. Okay, so here I'm being kind of a bit of an arsehole. So static as a keyword that is not in a function declaration and not a property declaration, this actually refers to the current class. Or rather, it refers to the class on which this is being called. So I could write new self. That's if I could only type it. So if I wrote new self, that would always be curl PSR handler. So that would create a new instance of curl PSR handler specifically. If I write static, then if somebody calls fake network handler : run, they will get an instance of fake network handler. That's what it means. That's the special difference that's there. So this is, you don't see this kind of thing very often. Obviously, new creates a new object, and the thing in brackets goes into the constructor, which I might not even have, because a constructor isn't required. Yeah, I think I don't have one. But yes, if there were arguments in the constructor, they would go in there. Yeah, so that's just creating a new instance of whatever the thing is that's being called on. I suppose I would kind of discourage using this kind of pattern, but yeah, it's a complicated thing. The matter of creating an object without using new. Yes, it's a complicated matter in terms of what you expect and what can actually be done. So this does a bunch of methods in a row. So each of these methods actually returns something. And because this is in the fluent style, which is to say it's got with or set or get at the beginning of each of the method names, with and set will always return an object of the same type. And specifically, yeah, so set will always return the same object, whatever $this is. With will typically return a different object, but one that has all of the same properties up to that point. Yes, by cloning the object. Clone takes a complete copy of the current object, and it leaves the old one where it was. And then you can operate on it just like it's $this, essentially. And this pattern is one that you will see quite often in Fluent code. But you may also see set, which does the same thing without clone and just operates on $this. It depends on whether you anticipate people wanting to keep the original object or throw it away. Because if they are going to be keeping it, then they would have to separately clone it if there's not a with method. And if they don't want to keep the original one, if they want to throw it away, then using with will technically produce too many clones, and it may be that they're actually expecting to have at the end the same value, and if they are, then they'll be confused with all of the with things. But in this kind of context, it's fine because double handler isn't used outside of this method, so that's not a problem. So with TLS verification, returns the same as static, it's the same type. And then with timeout, returns the same type, and then run simple does something different in this case, and returns something that I've decided to assign the value of responses to. And then you can see I'm just doing a for each on this and doing another call chain and then returning. So this is a bit of semi-evil trickery that I do sometimes. Yes, under some circumstances, you might have an iterable value or an array, and you only actually want the first one, but for some reason you might, so you might be concerned about the possibility of not ever having anything, and yeah, I mean, I don't like this. This is actually technically bad code. This should actually throw an exception at the bottom because this has a path where it doesn't return anything. But anyway, what I was trying to say is that sometimes you may have an iterable value in the response, and you just want the first one, but because it's an iterable value but not an array, then you can't say square bracket 0 on it. You need to actually run through an iteration. There are ways of specifically trying to get the first value from an iterator, but mostly it's easy to just do a for each loop and just return at the bottom of it. So this for each will run exactly once, or rather it will run 0 1 times, and it will return sensibly at that time. But if it runs 0 times, then I'm kind of messed up. So yeah, I should throw an exception here. I'm just going to type that out. So throw new /runtime exception, and with no responses. This is actually a good example of a bad exception, but this is also a good example of the kind of thing that you would do when you're kind of in the middle of writing code. So a bad exception is better than no exception. So in it goes. This is making sure that the code works sensibly is top priority, and then I can come back later and I can make it work well. But yes, so this is a generic exception it's throwing, which means that any caller that has a try catch won't really be able to catch it meaningfully. It won't be able to understand what this exception is. It will only be able to perhaps say, you know what, I'm catching all exceptions, I don't care. So yeah, that's just not really optimal. But I will write throws on this. So throws runtime exception if there were no responses. So this is how you would normally document that a throw exists in there. It's not super useful to have that because obviously you might throw things without realizing it because control flow might come through here because let's say with timeout might throw. But it's still somewhat helpful to write these things down if for no other reason than somebody could look at the documentation and see the things which would natively throw. Right, so here we have a property. Yay, first property that I've come across. So these are just the scope. These can be static. That's a valid thing, although strictly speaking, you would consider those to be variables rather than properties. and they can be private, or they can be public, or they can be protected. Same as basically everything else. And the documentation for this is at property and the type. So you can include the name. I think that's valid documentation, but usually you put it immediately before the actual name it's talking about. So there's no real value in doing that. You can see that this has a default value. So that is a value which will be assigned between the start of object creation and the constructor being run. So if there were a constructor in here, as soon as the constructor starts, the property called timeout will be 2000, but it could reassign it in principle. You can see, yes, down here, this is how you refer to properties, which is a little bit annoying. So you can see that. So if I'd referred to, I don't even know where debug is. Debug was probably further down actually. If I'd referred to timeout, so here's timeout. There you go. That makes life a little bit easier to give us an example. So I can see the name is $timeout here, but it's timeout here, and that's something that you might be annoyed with. And in fact, if I were to write $timeout here, that wouldn't even work. That would be referring to a non-existent. That would be referring to a property named by a non-existent variable. A whole mess would occur. So yeah, the way you refer to properties is just with the arrow syntax, like you do with methods. Despite the fact that they actually start with the $sign every time you refer to them, you do not include that $sign. That's just the PHP way, and that's inherited from other languages which perhaps wouldn't have these styles of declarations, basically. So got two private properties here. So these are not available to child objects. So obviously they'll exist on instances of child objects, but the child objects themselves in their own code will not be able to access them. So we've got a protected function here. Yes, good look at that. Void return. I'm pleased that I added that because that makes it nice and clear. So technically you can have a return statement in a void return function. It would just be return on its own with no arguments. But if you do have a void return, you would often not include it because it has no value at the end. And the only situation where you might do it is if you were returning early, which is a perfectly valid thing to do. Okay, so here is the default, the main instance of run iterator. It is quite long, so this is a bad thing for testing, because I know that there's this chunk of code, so from line 70 to line 202, so 131 lines, 132 lines. What am I doing? I can just do basic maths. Yeah, so there's over 100 lines here, which are just never going to be tested, at least not in the stuff that uses fake network handling. In fact, there is. I happen to know that one of those tests does actually, or at least multi-request will test it properly. Yes, so here we're actually doing the original assignments that I had before. We're doing a bunch of stuff with curl. So curl is the way that in PHP you do anything with URLs, or rather, sorry, you do network requests in essence. So there are other ways of doing network requests if you just want the data. So you can use, if you turn allow URL fopen on, then you can use fopen for that purpose. Mostly people don't though, and that means you're using curl, and curl is a C library that is bridged to PHP, which is to say that there are a bunch of PHP methods which were created which call underlying C methods, or rather, well, I'm saying C, it's binary. And so it doesn't have any concept of operating as an object, and it's got a lot of these constants. That's what these things which are just letters and nothing else, no dollar sign, these are constants. So, and in fact, these are top level constants, which is in itself particularly nightmarish. You don't want to have these, but you do have them. So, c'est la vie, you're going to deal with this. And the way that these calls, the syntax for these is exactly the same as the C API for curl, as it happens, to the extent that that's possible, at least. So thank you, no email. Yes, so this actually, so curl setup array, I believe, is an exception to that. I would have to check. I'm not going to bother to check right now. Certainly, curl setup array is documented at php.net. In fact, I'll look at that. Yeah, and get some information from it. But this is the kind of thing which would be very likely to be a convenience method that was added by the PHP guys, so that you can just do a bunch of things all at once. Where otherwise you would have to call curl setup repeatedly. That's the way it would work. And in fact, this is actually, yes, this is an actual example of a key value array, an actual associative array. This is amazing. So the way that associative arrays are expressed in PHP, if it's an inline array declaration, so sometimes you see array, open bracket, and a bunch of things. Mostly, if it's in reasonably recent code, it's just an open square bracket. And then it's pairs, which are key equals greater than value. You can have the same key in multiple times. If you do, I believe the last one will win, will be the one that you have. You can, again, mix them, technically. If you did that, so if like this did not have a key on it, then this implicitly has the key 0, because it has a key which is, I think, the highest numbered key plus 1. Sorry, yeah, the highest numbered key plus 1, unless there are no keys, in which case it's 0. But in general, you don't want to have mixed arrays. It's a bad thing. It's a whole mess. Okay, so here we've got a closure, which is kind of a complicated concept if you're not familiar with those. So you might think when you're inside a function, hey, it's got the variables. I can see the variables that are above here. That's actually not the case in PHP by default. And that's to make sure that if this function is called later, when you're no longer in this method, it still makes sense. But it's possible to explicitly say that you want the variables which are elsewhere in here. And in other words, that you want to capture them. That's what the terminology is. And to do those, you put them into a little block called use immediately after the arguments. So this, $this, as it happens, is just always present. That's just because that's just a quirk of how PHP functions work. But for everything else, you can either put the variable name on its own, which means that you are accepting the variable at its current, so you're accepting the variable passed by value in the sense that it would normally be passed by value. So here it's $k, which is just a number. So that's going to be completely static. Perfect example of something that can pass by value. If you put an ampersand, that means you want it to be passed by reference, which in particular for this case means that you want any future versions of this variable which may have had further assignments. So a quirk of the way that arrays work in PHP is that array assignments like this technically produce a different value. They produce a value which is not known to this inner function if it doesn't have the ampersand at the beginning. So by having the ampersand there, you're saying, I do want all future values of this. So just please give me whichever one is up to date at that time. If I were using an object, I would never need to put an ampersand there. This is only because I'm using a value that's getting reassigned, essentially. Well, I suppose technically if I were using an object that were literally reassigned, that would be the case. Okay, so that's me, half an hour again. So I'm going to stop here. I probably won't come back to this very soon, but who knows? I'm done with this session for now. That's what I'm saying. So thank you for watching.